Hi, I'm with Michelle Leader of Footnoted. She is the editor and founder of that publication. And she's going to talk about the fun of digging into financial filings and finding all sorts of stuff buried in there, as well as Robinhood's S1 and some of the stuff she's found in that filing. Thanks so much for talking, Michelle.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
All right. Well, just to start, can you kind of explain the story of Footnoted, how it came to be, what its business model is or was, and just kind of what it's all about?
Yeah, so I've been doing Footnoted for quite a long time. It's actually 18 years now. So I am original, like the OG of financial blogging, or maybe a grandma of financial blogging. I started it after writing a book that came out in 2003. So just about 18 years ago. It came out in the fall, late August, early September of 2003. And it was called Financial Fine Print. And if you think back to way back then, my background was as a daily journalist, a daily business journalist. And so I wanted a way to continue the conversation with people. When you're writing a book, it's the type of thing that you write the book and then maybe 9 months later it's actually published. And so there's a very long lag between what you've reported and, when it actually sees the light of day, as opposed to now of course, Twitter wasn't around in 2003, but, you just find something interesting, you tweet it out, it's instantaneous.
Right.
And so, this was a way, back then, it was a way to sort of continue the conversation. And I didn't really start out thinking, no, this is going to be a business model, or it was really just a way to kind of hold myself accountable to continue reading SEC filings. I had always, as a younger journalist, I had always been fascinated by SEC filings. I thought that I had heard someone who, is a mentor, of mine, Nell Minow, who was, an amazing woman and is an amazing woman, not was. And, she gave a presentation all about digging into SEC filings and what that meant. And I remember hearing that as a young reporter, and it just fascinated me that you can find all this stuff in SEC filings. And around the same time, I had also heard a presentation by Diana Enriquez, who is one of the star reporters of the New York Times, has since retired from the Times, but, was the, driving force behind the Bernie Madoff stories. And, she had given a somewhat similar presentation also about how the documents would set you free and to really focus on the documents. And the two of those together really got me started on this path of really digging into SEC filings. And some of it was also from my own investing experience. I had at that point in my career, I had been out of college about 10 years, so I had worked at daily newspapers and as a business journalist the whole time. And so I thought that, I knew a lot about investing, and I got burned on shares of Quest Communications. And I bought it and watched it go up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it fell. And, the shares were worth, less than what I paid for it, which of course you always want to avoid. And what was interesting to me was what did I do? I basically, I had friends who were doctors or who were going through medical school at the time, finishing and it was all what went wrong? Let's do a post-mortem. And what was interesting to me was that when I actually went through and read Quest's 10Qs, which I should have been reading, I knew enough to read, but I didn't bother to do it. And had I done that, I would have, really sold the stock. I would have seen enough red flags in those filings that I would have sold the stock and still made money. Because a lot of times what happens is that something is disclosed in a filing and, it becomes sort of, because it takes a lot of effort to get to it. And not everyone does read the filings. It can take a couple of months until it becomes sort of, baked into the, public knowledge or baked into the price.
Right, that makes sense. And the business model has that changed or shifted? I understand it was bought by Morningstar and then you bought it back. How did that work exactly?
So the business model initially, there was no business model initially when I first started the site in 2003. It was really just to support the book. And for the first, I think, like 2 years, I'd have to go back to the Wayback Machine. But I think for about the first 2 years, the first page that you saw when you landed on Footnoted was basically the book homepage.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't, even though I was doing the blog every day, I basically made a point of writing something about an SEC filing every single day. It was like a tab off of the, off of the main Footnoted site. And it was only after I started picking up, I remember, around 2005, maybe 2006, after I'd been doing it a couple of years, the Wall Street Journal called it a blog for those in the know. And that's when I started to get more serious about, I moved the blog, the content to the front of the first page, the landing page of the site. And then the book became a sub, part of the site. And that's when I started. So I would say the first 2 years, there was no business model. And then slowly I became, I focused on the business model. And the business model was basically, it became pretty clear to me that, a lot of people were giving me advice about you should just write about Apple and, Apple and Google and, all of, that kind of thing, write about 3 or 4 different companies. And that didn't really interest me. I really wanted to write about, sort of the broader set of companies. My very first post, by the way, was about Delta Airlines, which was interesting. If I go back to August of 2003, it was about Delta Airlines. So there was, that was the business model. It became pretty clear to me that, there was no clickbait, no SEO model for SEC filings. A lot of people were going in that direction. If you think back to the late 2000s, it was all about getting clicks and all about clickbait. And that really stayed the model, quite frankly, for the next 10 or so years. It's only been relatively recently that people have moved more toward the subscription model, especially smaller publications, and I would consider myself a smaller publication. It was all about getting eyeballs. And the bottom line is that you're only going to get a certain number of people who are interested in SEC filings no matter what.
Sure.
It's not, I think it's fascinating, but, it's not Kim Kardashian by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. But you had subscribers, right?
I did, yeah. So afterwards, at first I started a subscription-based model early on, and I think that was maybe around 2008, right after the market kind of, imploded. It was not a good time to start a subscription model. And so I was doing that, and then Morningstar came along and bought the site in 2010, and I worked for Morningstar for the next 2.5 years. And then I bought it back from them. It turned out a lot of mergers, and this is sort of a dirty secret of M&A, they just don't work out. They don't work out for the founder, especially if you're a founder and who's very passionate about your product. And you get swallowed by a larger organization. Of course there's going to be changes, right? That's what happens. That's, normal. Right. And some of those changes are good, and some of those changes are a little bit harder to swallow. When it's something as close, something that you've built yourself. And I think a lot of founders, quite frankly, struggle with that. I'm sure you've interviewed other founders who, have also had the same situation where this was not, I sold because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and, things didn't work out quite the way that I had hoped them to work out. And so I, then went back on my own independent, and that's where I've been really for the last 8 years or so. We had a high-priced product that was primarily going to hedge funds and to other institutional investors. We were doing custom research for a number of institutional investors as well. So it was going very well. And then a large quant fund decided that they were going to hack into my site and steal all my data.
Oh, no.
And that kind of set me back a little bit because that was a problem.
Oh, no. Well, anyway, sorry.
So there's been ups and downs on the road to entrepreneurship, obviously. I'm still very passionate about SEC filings and what you find in them. I think that they're important for, maybe not like just the passive investor to read, but if you're actively buying stocks, you need to be knowing what's going on at the companies that you own.
Right, of course. I remember from journalism school, people talking about making sure you read the footnotes, but it's having the discipline to do that is really, really pretty exceptional.
Yes.
So where do you find the most interesting footnotes usually? What kinds of filings, what kinds of companies?
I spent a lot of time looking at, I spent a lot of time looking at 8Ks, at 10Ks, at 10Qs, the proxy statements. The proxy statements are always very fascinating because that's like one of the few places where people talk about pay and compensation, right? And so the same way where you probably wouldn't ask me how much do I make a year, and I wouldn't ask you how much you make a year, in the proxy statement, it's laid out for anyone to see. And the types of things that you see in there are just like, kind of amazing, quite frankly. Like you see, you see things like, just all sorts of crazy, like not just regular compensation, but you'll see like apartments in Manhattan, like people paying $18,000 a month for, an apartment in Manhattan, or you'll see, for a CEO or a CFO or someone else up the ladder, you'll see people paying to move someone else's pets. That was a good, just like crazy, pretty much anything you can think of, any perk you can think of, you will find it I've found it in proxy statements. So I like to say that like proxy statements are the sexiest documents, even though most people don't think about SEC filings being particularly sexy, and that's true. But they are really interesting because you get like a window into sort of, compensation and how, both directors. I remember reading, Apple's filing and looking at like Al Gore getting like 4 or 5 different laptops. And I'm thinking like, okay, it's just sort of like you find things like that. Like that's not the type of thing that a company is going to advertise. Like, oh, we give our directors, 4 or 5 laptops and an iPhone and this and that. One of my favorite findings was at Chesapeake Energy, and that was where the company disclosed that it had bought a map collection from the former CEO, Aubrey McClendon, and had spent like $14 million on an antique map collection that was owned by the CEO, and that they were displaying in the corporate offices as part of and it just seemed like, there was another one where a company bought a fish shack. They called it a fish shack, but it turned out to be a 5,000 square foot lodge. I think like shack and 5,000 square feet should be mutually exclusive. But you just see crazy sorts of things in there.
Wow, that is pretty great.
And, that brings us to the Robinhood filing yesterday. Yep. Just yesterday, I was looking through that S1, and I don't look at S1s all that often, but, when I do, it's usually, pretty interesting. And you saw that the general counsel had gotten like over a $4 million signing bonus. Now, I recognize that signing bonuses are in vogue right now, but still, $4 million signing bonus is quite a hefty signing bonus. And on top of that, $30 million worth of options.
Yeah.
And, that's a lot of money. For an attorney especially, for someone who, on the legal side of things, the legal talent. And so that raises a lot of interesting issues and questions. There were a lot of other interesting tidbits in that filing, too. Talked about how, one of the co-founders, Vlad Tenev, had gotten had received a subpoena from the U.S. Attorney's Office for his cell phone. I don't remember reading that anywhere else. I don't think that was something, I don't remember the company putting out a press release on that or saying this. It was like buried on page 40 something of this S1. And that's the type of thing that you're going to find, in a filing. I happened to stumble across it.
Yeah. You tweeted several things and they were all fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it was all like, as I was reading it, I was just like, what? What did they say? It was kind of like, it was kind of like a little shocking to me. So hopefully that came across in the tweets.
Yes, definitely. Are there any kind of sort of broad conclusions you can start to draw from some of these things that are disclosed. For instance, perhaps Robinhood might be expecting to be attacked by regulators for quite some time, maybe, and that's why they might have wanted to pay a former SEC commissioner so much to be on their payroll. Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably, I'm sure that, Dan Gallery's a smart guy.
I'm sure.
I'm sure he went in there with eyes wide open and was like, this could be a potential problem, and I don't mind taking it on, but I'm going to, risk reward, right? I mean, if someone asks you to go work at a nuclear reactor, are you going to do it for minimum wage, or are you going to expect a premium? And this is kind of like working at the nuclear reactor in a different way, shape, and form. But you're dealing with a company that has a lot of regulatory issues. They're very clear in their risk factors about the payment for order flow, which is, a major part of their business model. And then another major part of their business model is cryptocurrency and
the Dogecoin.
Yeah. And so if either of those, the payment for order flow, and what was interesting also is they said that, something like over 50% of their payment for order flow revenues, which was something like over 75% of total revenues, came from 4 companies, and they didn't have any contract with them. And so you have to wonder, if, and I'm assuming because it's been well reported that one of those companies is Citadel, but if Citadel senses that this is too much, this is too stressful for them, they could just pick up and leave.
Right.
I'm sure they don't appreciate being dragged through the mud. They're a large investment fund. I'm sure they don't appreciate being dragged through the mud on this, being tied to Robinhood and doing something that's potentially, maybe whether it's, I'm not saying that it's illegal or not, but it seems unseemly.
It's attracting attention from regulators for whatever reason. Yes.
If you look at it, they're there's all sorts of, there's state regulators, there's the Attorney General in Massachusetts who's looking at it. There's, members of Congress, there's been hearings, there's the SEC,
the
there's
FINRA
FINRA.
thing. Yeah.
Most people want to walk the other, run the other way from that kind of thing. And I guess if you're going to run toward it, then you're just going to ask for a lot of money to be compensated.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You also found some interesting things in the filings for J. Jill, which you mentioned in a column for Bloomberg, talking about the incoming CEO, the woman CEO, being paid $300,000 less than the former male CEO. How did you go about determining that, and what kind of things did you look at?
Well, I wanted to look at, we see a lot of stories about women getting into the C-suite a lot more. And that's also, it's very encouraging as a woman. It's certainly great to see more women being, promoted and making it to, the top of the totem pole, so to speak, whether it's CEO or CFO. I started seeing a lot more women CFOs. And so I wanted to take a look at that. There's very few women CEOs of, let's say, even Russell, 1000 companies. But what I wanted to do is take a look at a lot of these CFOs and see, are they being paid the same amount as their male counterparts? And what was really, I first noticed this actually back in 2012 when Ginny Rometty was named CEO of IBM, and she was being paid $300,000 less than the man she replaced. And it was just kind of sitting there in the back of my mind. And so recently I had found another example at Merck when they named a female CFO, and then the man who had been CFO went up to become CEO. And his salary continued to be high, but then her salary was not as high as his was before. I think that, look, it's not obviously, there's never, if you have two people, even though they have the same title, it can sometimes be, obviously someone's going to have more experience and or less experience. But I think that, if someone is the CFO, they have a certain amount of responsibility, especially at a large publicly traded company. And they should be, paid the same as the man whose job. I mean, if it was off a little bit, you want to say like, okay, well, she doesn't have as much experience, but like $200,000 or $300,000 less seems like, less than, it ought to be. I don't know what that number could be, and question, one of the things I raise is that a lack of experience or a lack of opportunity. There aren't a lot of women who get to be CFO. And so at a major, large, publicly traded company. So maybe it's just that now, it's still going to take a little while, right? Like you still hear about the pay parity, and women making less to, less. But if it's happening at the upper echelons of American companies, what does that mean for like sort of a mid-level, like a marketing manager or, some other, finance manager or somewhere else a lot further down the pecking order? And so I think it's really important to focus on this. I think that there ought to be, some sort of pay parity, maybe if it's not exactly because this person doesn't have as much experience, but again, $200,000 to $300,000 less seems like a significant,
Right.
and what I found with Merck, for example, was, it's a Dow 30 company and they have made a lot of progress. They do have, a couple of, their board of directors has 3 women on it, which is very impressive. So there's definitely some positives there. I don't mean to say it's all negative, but when you have a situation where, a woman is making, significantly $200,000 less than the man she replaced, it does raise some questions about that, and why the pay parity doesn't exist there.
Right. Yeah. And just backing up a bit, I meant to ask you initially, what got you into journalism in the first place? It seems like you didn't have a journalism degree, right? Like you have an
No, I had an economics degree. Yeah. So I was always interested in like business and business journalism. And so that's basically been the arc of my career, is focused on business and business journalism.
Where did you first start?
I worked at the Tampa Tribune. That was my first job out of college.
Nice.
Paper no longer exists. It was shut down.
Cool.
Yeah, it was shut down when the St. Petersburg Times, which is not called the St. Petersburg Times, but
now the Tampa Bay Times or whatever.
Yeah, Tampa Bay Times bought the Tampa Tribune about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't even remember, and they shut it down. So. And so I spent the first 4 years of my post-college life down in Florida.
Oh, okay.
And it was a good place to be a journalist. So.
Right. Lots of good stories.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking. This has been really interesting.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, and have a great long holiday weekend.